Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Very welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. Today we will talk about the WTO, the challenges, the crisis, and possible ways forward. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a senior fellow, non-resident, at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. I am very honored and happy to have two very qualified guests with me today who know a lot about WTO. We have Dr. Mia Mikic, who is advisor at large for Asia Pacific Research and Training Network on Trade, a research fellow at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and she's also a member of the Global Trade Female Network, Trade Explorers. And we have Alan Wolf, who is former Deputy Director General of the WTO. He's now a distinguished visiting fellow at Peterson, and he is writing a book about Peterson to be published in about a year. So you're both very welcome. Thank you for joining. This is a very timely discussion. As we talk, in this very moment, WTO ministers have gathered in its 12th ministerial conference in Geneva. It has been postponed several times already. The last time they met was in Buenos Aires in December 2017, but due to the COVID, it has been postponed. But now it's finally taking place. And we just got news that it's going to be prolonged for one extra day. It was supposed to end this afternoon European time, but it will go on one extra day. Whether that is good news or bad news remains to be seen. The WTO has, of course, been in crisis for a long time in all its three main pillars, in the pillar of trade liberalization and rules, in the one on trade policy monitoring, and the one on dispute settlement. And these problems have been going on for quite some years, but they worsened during the Trump trade wars era, the pandemic, of course, and now with Russia's war on Ukraine and the sanctions. It is the first time in WTO's history that one member state invades another. There is not much hope that a lot will come out of the ministerial conference, but it is useful that they meet, that they talk, and that exchange views. After all, WTO has 164 members and accounts to about 98% of global trade. The need for multilateralism and global rules and norms is probably bigger than in a very long time. We have food shortages, we have possible famine risks, health issues at the top of the agenda. And an organization like WTO should be very well placed to set some of these global standards. The Director General of WTO has been traveling the world and urging members to just try to come together with solutions, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And she has encouraged countries to agree on fishery subsidies. That's a long story that goes on for almost 20 years. 3 billion people in the world depend on fisheries for their living. Yet 1/3 of the global fish stocks are overfished, and there's a lot of subsidies involved. She also asked them to try to agree on a framework to allow easier access to vaccines, a package on how to address the emerging food crisis, a renewal of the moratorium for the ban on duties on e-commerce. That sounds very technical, but it's extremely important. And some sort of work program or roadmap for the way ahead. So this is what she wanted to put on the agenda, and ministers are discussing it. We don't know exactly, of course, what has come out yet. We'll probably know that within 24 hours or so. But Alan, how do you see this? What could possibly come out of the ministerial this week?
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia. Pleasure to be with you and Mia. It's a greater, more full agenda than perhaps any other ministerial in recent times. There's a lot pending. There's a food crisis, obviously, that you mentioned. And one thing on the agenda is to have an agreement that there'll be no export restrictions on food purchased by the World Food Program that helps feed the poorest of the poor in countries that are net food importers. There is a discussion of public stockholding, which has some greater relevance. The Indians would like to be able to open up the storehouses, and they would say feed the world, and the agricultural exporters are concerned that this will disrupt markets. That's an issue. Whether there's an agricultural work program going forward is still possible. Difficult, but some would like to see that. Secondly, the pandemic. Will intellectual property be waived, rights be waived? That some feel that is one answer to getting vaccines around the world. Others disagree very strongly. And there are principles that Ambassador Walker of New Zealand put forward as to how to deal with a pandemic, this one. Fishery, you mentioned fishery subsidies. Will even illegal fishing still be subsidized? Will developing countries have another generation to fish in areas that are overfished already is a question. E-commerce, which you mentioned, will tariffs for the first time, will import duties be placed upon electronic transmissions on e-commerce, which would fragment the world, really, if that occurs. The environment, there's a group of countries that want to see fossil fuel subsidies, have at least a work program on that subject to curb fossil fuel subsidies. The Chinese would like to see more work done on plastics pollution in the oceans. The reform of the organization, which we'll get into, I'm sure, later, but why can't agreements be reached more easily? Why can't disputes be settled definitively, which is now not the case for many countries? And so restoring dispute settlement to make agreements enforceable and binding. And lastly, and I know Mia will get into this, issues like gender, how women will be treated better by trade, and small and medium enterprises. So it's a very full agenda. Now, there's still a possibility for some good things to come out of this, although there are differences on everything. Among 164 countries, one is not going to see instant resolution. But I think it's a good sign that it's extended by a day, better than in Seattle in 1999. They had to vacate the hall, and they weren't done, and it was a very messy conclusion. So I'm hopeful that the one day will be of some assistance.
Well, it is always good that they meet. I remember in Nairobi in 2015, it was extended by 2 days. And that was actually good because there was some sort of conclusion and a few modest but still important decisions being taken. So as you say, it's always better that they sit there and talk than that they slam the door and leave. So indeed, a very full agenda, and we don't know what they will come out with. What's your view on this, Mia? Is this going to be some baby steps forward, or is it already doomed as a failure?
Well, I am, first of all, thank you very much, Cecilia, for inviting me to the Trade Winds. This is one of my favorite conversations online, and I'm a very loyal sort of listener and subscriber, so it is a privilege. And if I may add, just one fact is that all three of us belong to a group called Friends of Multilateralism Group. And obviously the group is being established to promote multilateral and global solution. So I hope the audience will not hold it against us, because it's obvious from the perspective that we will be sort of garnering here. And Alan has really put it all on the table, and probably there is some change to add to it. I'm not so sure. I'm actually optimist in nature, but I have to admit that I have revealed my opinion on what we expect or what we should be expecting from NC12 already sort of last September, when I facilitated one regional consultation and had to write a comment on that. And at that point of time, based on consultation of Asia-Pacific economists and what was discussed, and it was a pretty shallow and non-enthusiastic discussion, if I can say. We tried to boost it up, but my assessment at that time was that if we end up with a deal on fisheries subsidies, that would be a good outcome for MC12. And the reason why I thought it was a good, of course, that can be seen also in the context of what Dr. Ngozi is saying, that she would want to see at least two outcomes, right? So in that context, being humble and being realistic, fisheries, out of all the agenda that Alan was describing of what we have, would be really welcome, because it would show actually the commitment to sustainability and sustainable development, and would add to the credibility of all the ministers for, in a context of walking the talk. And if I just may add sort of a couple of points, while I was thinking about ministerial conference just prior November, which was the original date of the meeting before the COVID postponed it, I was assured that there were two items that will just fly very smoothly through the meeting. One was, of course, the text or the results on the domestic regulation on services, because by that point we already had a sort of a clean text. And another one was ministerial declaration on trade and gender, because that text also was sort of agreed, and we had lots of co-sponsors, etc. And I was wrong in 50%. We do have, thankfully, domestic regulation on services, but we are losing on the front of the gender and women. I think it's really good news that domestic regulation on services are sort of done and dusted, because we haven't had any success or any serious achievements on services front. And this being sort of geared towards reducing the costs in services trade and enabling efficiency and greater transparency in services trade is very welcome news. And so I think it would definitely be helpful to at least call that one achievement, or ticking it towards some results of the round. Now there are, of course, some possible other breakthroughs. I don't know whether they will happen in terms of the extension of the moratorium or not, and we'll just see. We'll just have to sleep through the night and see what will happen tomorrow.
Yes, thank you. Well, I agree with you that the agreement on services for domestic regulation is, of course, one indication that at least they can make some decisions. And for that, we'll have to see. Rumors has it that the agreement on fisheries, again, still after 20 years, is very difficult, and that particularly one country came up with totally new demands early this morning European time. So we'll have to see about that. But Dr. Ngozi also emphasized that this is an important meeting. Hopefully some results can come in, but it's just a stepping stone for a larger process. And you have both mentioned, I mean, the health crisis, obviously the food crisis, the fact that the sanctions and the war makes it a very high likelihood that some countries will starve. In Northern Africa and in the Middle East. And then we have, of course, the climate crisis. But even if there will not be agreements or very shallow statements on this, what could technically WTO do on these issues? Because it seems obvious for an outsider that WTO is is the forum to discuss these issues globally. Almost the whole world is a member of this organization, and you need global solutions. But what could technically be done if you disregard the lack of political will that is obviously there for the moment? Alan, would you like to start?
Well, on the topmost crisis of the moment, which is the food crisis, the WTO can't open the Black Sea, but it can smooth the movement of trade from places of surplus to places of need. It can assure that there are no export restrictions placed on unnecessarily on food exports. I think also eventually it has to have the ability to get ahead of crises. On the pandemic, the WTO was locked down physically, like most of the rest of the world, in March of 2020. And so 2.5 years later, they're talking about what should we do on a work program for 2013 as one of the primary outcomes. That cycle time is too slow. It has to anticipate crises and understand them and work towards solutions. So on the food area, as I say, opening up world trade, which is the primary answer. On the pandemic and future pandemics, coming up with solutions on a much faster basis to, again, open up markets, because not every country is going to manufacture vaccines or personal protective equipment. It has to move across borders. On fishery subsidies, frankly, if you look at, there was 4 days before the ministerial, there was a report from the chair of the fisheries negotiations. There were a lot of open issues. So it was leaving to ministers a very difficult task, it seemed to me, and of course complicated by India's and some others' demands. But they were optimistic about being able to come to closure. So I think extending the moratorium on e-commerce is extraordinarily important and possible. Give another 2 years to think through what should be done with respect to rules for digital commerce. So there's an upside here, but whether they can pull something together overnight, they worked late last night. So I'm hopeful that there can be some results, but it doesn't look very good right now. I think my optimism is about the future because it makes good sense to have global rules for global trade, and multilateralism makes a great deal of sense. And I think that will be the realization on the part of all eventually, but maybe not in Geneva this week.
Well, you were right, Mia, to point out that all three of us are biased and should have declared interest in the beginning, that we are in favor of a strong WTO, obviously. And it's still there can be some results, of course, until tomorrow. But you mentioned the food crisis, but also the health crisis. I mean, every country of the world has been affected by the pandemic, and some are still suffering severely from that. So it is really a global issue. And there was an attempt by India, the EU, US, and China to do a deal on not a TRIPS waiver, total patent waiver, but facilitate access to vaccine for poorer countries. And I know that there was a lot of investment and attempts leading up to the Geneva meeting to agree on that. But in the end, it seemed like only the EU stood by the agreement. So that's probably not in there anymore, but at least maybe some declaration. And also WTO has been working closely with WHO and other international organizations to reach some sort of agreement on this. Have you heard anything about the latest, Mia, on this and on or other issues?
Well, no, I just want to add something to what Alan was saying and what you were mentioning about the sort of positioning WTO in solving the current and future crises. And we know that future crises are just around the corner. And I think what is really preventing the work, and we didn't speak that word yet, but it is really trust deficit between the governments, but it goes also it spills into the communities, and so we have this enormous angst for things, values, people, foreign, right? And so I think the inclination. I just read, I think, the latest Pew Research Center research or poll on among Americans in terms of their preference for the government to take interest in international affairs. And 51% actually prefer for the government not to get involved in international affairs. And they instead prefer for governments to focus on domestic issues and problems. But here what we have is that there are no domestic, in today's world, where, which you described as it is, there is no closed economy, there is no domestic issues. We are all interlinked and codependent. And so just focusing on something what we think it's local is not going to help, because the problems may be actually originating somewhere else. And looking more holistically, we need to take interest across the borders. And I think WTO is actually positioned very well to try to use its underused capacity to build better body of information and knowledge and evidence about this interdependency between the economies, between, if you wish, people, and to sort of perform this this role of education, if you wish, or awareness building that would help people understand why it is important to continue to talk about global solutions, even though it is so attractive to just look in your backyard and think that you will be able to solve your own problems by just focusing on yourself. But we have seen that this doesn't work, and that sooner or later the fallacy of that approach is totally revealed.
Well, on
paper, I don't know if that complicates your the discussion, but I think yes, just sort of investing more in reducing this this angst and removing this, unlocking this trust deficit between the governments. And how do you do that? Is just by complete transparency. I mean, from GATT to the WTO, one single sort of red thread that we had was the principle of transparency, right? And I think we need to really nurture that, because even if countries want to keep markets closed, we need to force them to keep their books open so that we know what's happening. You know, we have trade policy reviews, and we have different other initiatives that can help people understand what is going on. I mean, Alan should be, you know, Alan, I should mention your great initiative of Trade for Peace that you have started and built really a network that worked towards building capacity of countries to use trade towards helping countries go out of conflict and to better living conditions. And now, unfortunately, we have distorted trade, no peace. And on top of that, as you, Cecilia, were saying, we have deep food insecurity rising, energy insecurity. We had possible stagflation spreading across the countries. We had debt crisis coming. So if we disregard and if we walk away from WTO as one of the pillar institutions of multilateralism, I think we will be doing disservice to everyone.
Yeah, if I could comment on the trade for peace aspect for a moment.
Please. Yes, please.
The World Trading System was founded back in 1947, 1948 to build peace, to sustain peace. It was what Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, foresaw before the United States was even in World War II at Argentia Bay for the Atlantic Charter Declaration. And it's relevant today, particularly, although the large countries have somehow forgotten that this was what it was all about, but it's very relevant today with respect to a lot of countries coming into the WTO, Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, Timor-Leste. These are countries that are hoping to integrate into the world trading system. In fact, while we're maybe pessimistic about the outcomes tomorrow, why are there 24 countries actively working to get into the WTO right now? Because they want to integrate into the world economy. For some of them, it's to recover from conflict, like Liberia, particularly. Afghanistan a while ago, and maybe again at some point. They're already in Liberia and Afghanistan, the last two to join. They're there to help improve the standard of living of their peoples and reduce the pressures for conflict. So trade for peace is still very much relevant, at least to quite a number of countries coming into the WTO. On Mia's point on transparency, what the WTO did in response to the pandemic was to get information out, working with others, like Simon Evenet, the Global Trade Alert and others, to get as much information out as possible on world food stocks 2.5 years ago when there were export restrictions put into place. Let policy planners and governments know what is going on. And there's a much, much better job that could still be done, but that the WTO did do a very good job at the outset of the pandemic in that regard. I'd say on the future of the WTO, a lot depends upon if really what's taking place is deglobalization, which I don't believe in long term. I can see more resilience of supply chains, but ultimately, actually, there's a gravitational pull towards more efficiency, that businesses really don't want to be directed by governments where they can source things less efficiently. And ultimately, David Ricardo was right, meaning that efficiency drives business, and business is going to, even one-person business working on the web, selling apps, they want to be able to sell wherever they can, wherever there's demand. And that will overcome, I think, ultimately the lack of trust and other obstacles to what is taking place in the divisive aspects of international relations now. And you mentioned, Cecilia, Russia, and of course, it can complicate things a little bit, but Russia has less than 2% of world trade, and that's diminishing by the day. It's not the determinative factor. The determinative factor is going to be what makes most sense for the world. And the WTO, and before it, the GATT, the World Trading System, has been just an enormous benefit to the world, and that is not going to change. So that gives me my long-term optimism, although I'm not placing a lot of bets on good outcomes tomorrow.
No, but tomorrow is just another day. Then there's Friday, and the discussion continues, because of course the notion of peace and trade has had a hit with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it still means, I mean, integrating countries in the global economy and setting global rules and making sure that there is a fair, level playing field is of course in the self-interest also of so many countries. So we need to come back to that realization in combination with trust, leadership, transparency, and political will, which seems not to be at its utmost right now. But moving forward, there has been some progress in discussions on e-commerce. Of course, during the pandemic also we see a huge boom in e-commerce, but the rules on a global level are, you know, from the fax machine time. So lots of things needs to be done. And in Buenos Aires, there was a launch of an initiative by several member countries that has now, I think there are 86 of them, including US, EU, China, to set global rules on e-commerce. And while they're not there yet, at least there has been some progress, and we call this a plurilateral agreement, because the rules of the game is that everybody needs to agree in the WTO, which means that one country can stop everything, but the plurilaterals, if they are open and if everybody can join and if they are transparent, is a way to move forward. Is this the way to start moving? If we don't agree on fishery subsidies, if we can't agree on waivers or on more climate or green trade, as well as on e-commerce, should we put more emphasis on plurilaterals, and that way achieving results and showing that WTO can still deliver? I know that you have written a lot about this in your coming book that I have had the privilege to peek at a few chapters from, Alan.
I think that the future is going to be those who are like-minded will be able to move forward, with others being welcome to join when they can. The WTO has always been multi-speed. The government procurement agreement was not joined in by all. The information technology agreement for duty-free trade for those high technology products, the IT products, was joined in by enough to cover 90% of trade, but it was not joined in by all. The pharmaceutical agreement was not joined in by all. But some countries think they can block this taking place at the WTO. I think they can't. The story of Buenos Aires was that those who wanted to get together could get together and negotiate on, as Mia said, domestic regulation of services, also micro and medium small enterprises, investment facilitation, and very importantly to world commerce, I think most importantly, e-commerce. And the day of reckoning will come to say, well, is this in the WTO or not? Or does everyone have to go elsewhere, as they started to do with services years ago, with the trade TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement? Or can they do it at the WTO? There's an interesting thing that, as I was writing this book, that occurred to me, that the reason these joint statement initiatives, these open plurilaterals, take place at the WTO is because the Director General said, it's within my mandate to support these endeavors, and I'm going to do it. And they did. Well, what would happen if there's a negotiated result on e-commerce, and they go to the Director General and they say, we want to host this, we want to have the WTO host this agreement. We have an agreement, we want it hosted here. And the Director General said, I think that's within my mandate, we'll support you. And dispute settlement, you've decided that you're going to have a dispute settlement provision, and we'll support that as well. Well, how is it blocked? You would need actually a consensus, which at the WTO now means unanimity, to block it. If the Director General said, we're going to host it here, and the members who are in it say it's an open plurilateral, anyone can join, but not everyone is in it yet because they're not ready. I think it just happens. If it doesn't, if the Director General sometime down the road, when that's ripe, says, well, I really can't do that because some members would be offended, they'll say, okay, we'll go elsewhere. We'll go to Paris, or we'll go to Nairobi, or we'll go to Auckland. But we're going to do this. So either the new rules for e-commerce for the digital world are going to be hosted at the WTO, or they won't, but they will take place. They will exist. And I think in the future, there is a path forward for the WTO to be the place for all agreements, including regional trade agreements, such as, say, RCEP, with the China and a number of countries are in, or CPTPP, what was the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If they said, we would like to have this hosted in Geneva, you have a good secretariat, we'll contribute money to support the WTO's budget, we'll enlarge the staff, but we want it done in Geneva. We want it done in one place. There's nothing stopping it. I think that is the future, to come back to Geneva, because the alternative is every agreement is hosted someplace else and is not open to others to join. That could happen with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, UK going in, China applying, and all of a sudden the growth of the governance of world trade is fragmented in just different parts of the world. I think that's not even a second best alternative. It's a bad alternative.
Yeah. Do you agree with this, Mia, that plurilaterals are the way forward, and a stronger and more flexible role for the Secretariat and the Director General to encourage member states to come together and do this within the sort of umbrella of WTO?
I see that happening, Cecilia, and I would fully agree with Alan when he said that WTO from the very beginning, and even GATT before that, was multi-speed and variable geometry. And even the fact that we have special and differential treatment actually indicates that not all members go to the target at the same speed and with the same commitments, right? So the spirit of that of different difference of the sort of path towards liberalization and creation of rules that will be valid for all is already there. I would be though careful how I call it, because sometimes when we say this is for the like-minded countries, often that is then understood as in ideological sense. And it's very difficult for me today to find a useful definition of like-minded, because when I see throughout Europe, I don't see that even the members of European Union all share completely the same position in terms of values and objectives and goals and instruments. Even if you look across the states of the United Nations, you would see that they, some of them sign memorandum of understanding with different countries, attempting to go away from sort of a like-mindedness of a federal. But anyway, I would call it a like and common purpose of a group of countries that would like to see a sort of progress and advancement in certain areas of trade rules that can be then used as a building blocks with others, so that they coherently support sustainable development. Because trade, we are not creating trade rules, as Dr. Ngozi says, for the trade rules' sake. We are creating it so that they help actually people. And I think it is very important to understand that on that part, we need to bring the proper actors to help us with. Because who trades is the corporate world. It's the firms and companies and small and medium-sized enterprises. Governments don't know much about actually export and import business, right? And so we need to bring business on board to help us understand how to create rules that will be actually better for trade. And WTO is one institution, I think, that doesn't have a permanent or even any business advisory council. I know that United Nations has one, development banks have one, but WTO doesn't have, right? It does have a sort of built in the inputs from academia and through the WTO chairs program, but it can be extended and it can be strengthened. And so bringing these actors on top of strengthening what Alan was suggesting, executive role, in the Secretariat itself, I think would create the environment for these different groups of countries with common interests to move forward without actually demolishing the basic principles of multilateralism.
Because we need to avoid the risk that plurilateral becomes a club of the coalition of the willing, and sort of creates a mini WTO within the WTO. The US have launched an interesting concept to the trade dictionary, the friend shoring concept, that only nice and kind countries who are buddies with each other should trade. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but of course the whole idea with WTO is that not like-minded countries can sit together and agree on a set of common principles, even if they are not like-minded. So there's a tricky balance there to be held. Maybe that is not a risk in the real world, but at least, you know, in the rhetoric today, it is a risk. Or how do you see it, Alan?
I think, you know, like-mindedness, the way I see it, is not different perhaps than what Mia has said, which is agreed on certain common purposes or principles. In the WTO, it's non-discrimination, national treatment, and transparency are the three largest principles that are out there. I think consensus has to be redefined. It can't mean unanimity. Not everyone is willing to go forward at the same time, the same speed. But what's the ultimate objective? The ultimate objective is a more open trading system, more rules-based, not to facilitate trade, not to channel it or impede it. I think that the WTO is about, and this is a debate at the WTO, the WTO is not about coexistence. It's about convergence, that market forces will determine competitive outcomes, leaving room for so-called policy space for necessary regulation for human safety or health or any of the public policies that are widely accepted, but not protectionism. I do see some countries would be able to accept more obligation. But let's say the least developed are going to find it difficult to just sign on to any e-commerce agreement, not knowing how it would apply to them, what it means for them. That's not true for all of them, but for some of them to say, well, we're really not ready. But for those who are ready, the question is, will they do it in Geneva or outside of Geneva? Because they will do it. And I don't, you know, when one talks about trading blocks, which is currently in the press a lot, and geopolitical and deglobalization, geopolitical fractures, what does it mean to have China applying to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, and Xi Jinping said at Shanghai Import Expo in November of last year, we can discuss rules on state-owned enterprises. We can discuss rules on industrial subsidies. you know, is I don't think one can afford not to take seriously when the head of state of the world's largest manufacturing country, largest exporting country of goods, says, we can discuss things that are of concern to you, that you sit down and see what can be done. I mean, the WTO should be about negotiation primarily. I mean, over time, it's a place for dispute settlement more than negotiation, because there haven't been many negotiations. But it's supposed to be set up so that countries can say, let's have a serious deliberation on what is needed in areas. And they've done that on fish. It may not come together tomorrow, but they have come a long way. They've started down the road, those who are interested, on e-commerce. They got to a finish line on domestic regulation of services and micro, medium, and small enterprises. It has to be the place for negotiations on trade. And you know, why multilateral? You can't have a subsidies agreement that doesn't include those who subsidize. So it's multilateral. It's essential that it be multilateral. So I think in the long term, things come back to Geneva. Short term, the reaction to a failure tomorrow, if that's what we see, would be one of two things. Let's redouble our efforts to see what can be done in Geneva, or let's actually spend our time investing elsewhere in other forums, which I think would be, in the medium term, short term, damaging, but I think that even that will be overcome in time.
The risk, of course, is that the actual fact of getting, say, China and US to sit together and forgetting their political differences and trade wars and others, and to try to see, is there anything here on the table we can agree upon, that it is so political for this, in this situation right now. So it might not happen on a short term, but how do we get them to do that? Because we all know that the only thing is to lock these and a few other key players, EU, Brazil, India, and a few others in the same room, and force them to talk, like when there's election of the Pope, don't go out of the room until the smoke is white. How do we get there? Because this is one of the key issues right now in moving forward on WTO. Maybe not tomorrow, but at least on the medium term.
Well, they're not at odds, for example, on climate change. I mean, when I say they, the United States and China, or the EU, United States and China, all agree something has to be done to make the system more responsive on climate change. They shouldn't really be at odds on the pandemic. There are global challenges. Is there room on subsidies to come, agricultural subsidies to come to an agreement? I would think so. The EU and the US have certain flexibilities that offend those who don't have those flexibilities. On the other hand, there's deep concern about the emerging developing countries, India and China, on the degree of their subsidization. Is there the makings of a deal there? There should be discussion. Is there a deal there on public stock holding? There should be some real deliberation and discussion. The Indian trade minister in Geneva said, we have stocks and we want to free them up to feed the world now during the current crisis. Is there some middle ground out there to do something that would be limited? It would not disrupt world markets, but in a time of crisis like this, where people will be starving, to say to the Indians, we can do something on public stock holding, and you have to accept that instead of everything that you want. And you know, there should be a way through it. If there's any goodwill out there, and Mia talked about lack of trust, there's not a strong feeling now that those who are taking strong opposing views aren't really able to negotiate or willing to negotiate.
How do you see it, Mia? Is it possible to overcome that lack of trust in the interest of some common good, at least on the medium term, maybe not tomorrow? or tonight?
No, I think it is, and I will go back to what Alan said. He said it is all about convergence, right? And it is, but convergence is actually, you know, understanding that two lines that are moving in a sort of same direction will come closer together and create one path. It is not, it is only in the context of economic growth convergence when we want one to sort of overlap with the another one, with the higher one, and so that poorer the same as the richer one and grow faster. But in all other processes, convergence is actually meeting two minds together and creating some new dynamism, right? And so I think if we apply that sort of notion to negotiations, then we would go much further than what was said, that negotiations have actually converted into a dictate and in demand and sort of just asking things to be, you know, done as we want, or nothing else. So then you are playing basically different games, and there are game strategists in that I'm not, so I cannot go into that field. But there are also ways to deal with that, right? But I fully support what Alan was saying. If China is saying that it's ready to discuss the norms of an advanced agreement such as CPTPP, please bring it to the table and discuss, and then make it enforceable, right? And so if you have another 12 countries that would act together and enforce it, then it will be a different situation, right? Then if only one country tries to play against China and its changing sort of mindset on trade. So I think it will be beneficial to bring such players into the blocks, and through these blocks, as Alan was saying, potentially deeper into the system.
Well, after all, at the Glasgow Climate Conference half a year ago, there was a joint statement made by US and China. It wasn't very detailed, but at least I think it was important. There are lots of questions coming in from the audience. Some of them we already touched upon there, but there's one here saying, what is the single most challenging issue to take on board in a perspective of WTO reform process? Is it possible to name one? Yeah, Mia?
I think it is the consensus-based decision-making. I think this, in my mind, Alan will know much better. But in my mind, this is the obstacle in many of the possible advances that can be made.
Do you agree, Alan?
Yeah, I do think that not every country, 164 countries, can have their hands on the emergency brake on every single issue. I think there has to be new flexibilities. There can be opt-outs of sorts, but it has to be understood. You can't stop everyone from those who want to move forward with coming together to improve the world trading system because you're not ready or just not on the same page. That's certainly one. I think that Mia pointed to this at the outset, much greater transparency. If a country puts on a measure at the border, why not have there'll be an instruction issued to someone at the customs service, put a CC on that email with that instruction to the WTO, so they know, everybody knows instantly what's taking place, not a year later in a TPR, 2 years later, but instantly everything that is taking place, so that governments can plan accordingly. They understand what's taking place. And I think that the WTO staff has become involved in foresight, which is understanding what crises might be out there, is going to be extremely important, as well as policy planning. I'd say one major change that would make a real difference is at the World Bank, the president chairs the executive directors, board of executive directors. At the fund, the managing director chairs the board of executive directors. We have no executive at the WTO. We have. It is not expected that the director general would put proposals on the table. They've only done it a few times in history. Arthur Dunkel did at the end of the GATT, or else we wouldn't have a WTO at all. Pascal Lamy, with respect to information gathering and publication for transparency during the financial crisis. So having a real executive, a chief executive, I think that would be next to consensus. I'd put that as number 2. Number 3 would be getting binding dispute settlement back.
Yes. that is a long discussion, but that, of course, I mean, if you put up rules, you need to be able to enforce them. So that is a key issue. There is one question that might be a little bit long, but just to flare on it before we end. It's about a proposal by Richard Haas that has suggested, and others have as well, actually, that if we want to restore the transactional latter date, a sort of Congress of Vienna that would gather the major global powers, recognizing the advantages of corporations to solve specific, even non-trade problems, just so a mode of minimal trust can be re-established to achieve other goals, including those regarding trade. Is the WTO's future ultimately dependent on such a sea change? There are others who have proposed sort of new Bretton Woods to after the crisis, after the pandemic, after the war, to come back and see how can we strengthen global institutions in general, but in this case, particularly WTO. That's a very difficult and long questions, but do you have any short views on that? Mia?
Well, I think it is dependent on revival of trust, and how we will get that revival, that's a different story, right? But I don't think that long-term WTO will survive all these challenges without actually members placing this trust. And I think members actually hide behind this confusion in the general public about what WTO is, because many people are confused and think that WTO has executive powers that Alan was talking about. And when you talk to Secretariat, they will say, well, it's members only, right? So we have this sort of situation in which one can hide behind the others. And it will be good to actually clarify that. And put a sort of more transparency into that, and take it from there.
Yeah, my European history may be a bit rusty, but it seems to me there was a cataclysm called Napoleon who cleared the way for the Congress of Vienna. And the question is, what suddenly brings everyone? When I say everyone, the major powers together. Including India and China, the United States, the EU, and some others. What suddenly brings them all together? Say, now we've got to act. If the planet were burning up because of climate change, maybe they come together, but that's not tomorrow. Another pandemic. We did a pretty shoddy job. We, being the countries of the world, did a very shoddy job of coming together to agree from day one. We're going to share supplies, personal protective equipment, masks, ventilators. We now have vaccines. We're going to make sure they're out there. We're going to anticipate problems and work together. Well, that's about governance. How do the major countries, or how do 164 countries govern trade to the extent that it's needed, and it is needed. So I don't see, 1947, 48, there were 50 to 70 million people who had been killed in a horrendous war that girdled much of the planet. The developing countries were coming out of colonial times. It was a time of a hegemon at the time, unopposed by anyone else. We don't have that. So I'll not buy air tickets yet for my trip to Vienna for the next Congress of Vienna.
Okay, there's so much more to discuss, but unfortunately we have reached the hour. Thank you so much, Mia. Thank you so much, Alan, for sharing and giving us at least some way forward and some hope for tomorrow. Then let's see what comes out of the ministerial tomorrow. But I mean, there will be a day after the ministerial as well, and lots of work to do. Some more realistic than others, but at least some concrete proposals are there. Thank you, all of you who zoomed in from different parts of the world as well. And next time we will talk about China. Until then, have a nice evening, afternoon, night, or morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting us.